Don't get on that plane. Annie's voice sliced through the steady rumble of jet engines and the clipped murmur of suited men discussing departure clearance. Michael Whitmore did not stop. At 40 years old, he had built a reputation on discipline. Time was leverage. Punctuality was power. He walked with the forward-leaning urgency of someone whose minutes were worth more than most people's annual salaries. His phone was pressed to his ear. "Yes," he said calmly, eyes on the aircraft stairs ahead of him. "We'll be airborne shortly." His assistant's voice came through tight and insistent from Washington. "Michael," the secretary moved the meeting up. "If you're not in the air in the next 3 minutes, this becomes a scheduling issue with defense oversight. We cannot afford optics right now." Whitmore checked his watch. 3:58 p.m. "I'm boarding," he replied. Behind him, small footsteps pounded against concrete. "Sir, please." He ended the call and exhaled slowly, irritation flickering across his expression as he turned. A little girl stood several yards away, braids slightly uneven, oversized sweatshirt sleeves covering half her hands. She looked no older than 6. Security had already noticed her but had not intervened. She didn't look threatening, just misplaced. "You can't be in this area," Whitmore said evenly. Not harsh, not warm, simply factual. "Don't get on that plane," Annie repeated, breathless. Whitmore gave the kind of polite nod adults reserve for children who believe they've discovered something important. "I appreciate that," he said, turning back toward the stairs. He placed one foot on the first metal step. "They're going to activate it after 10 minutes, she cried. That made him pause, not because he believed her, because of the word activate. His assistant's warning echoed in his mind. "Wheels up, now." He glanced over his shoulder. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Annie's chest rose and fell rapidly. She pointed toward the aircraft. "The pilot," she said. "He was talking on the radio." Whitmore's expression remained skeptical but attentive. He was a cybersecurity expert. He had spent half his career teaching executives not to dismiss anomalies outright. "What did he say?" he asked. Annie swallowed, then spoke in Russian, clear, fluid, precise. "Когда самолет будет в воздухе 10 минут активируем." Whitmore's foot slowly came off the stair. The engines hummed steadily behind him. She continued, eyes locked on his. "Пассажиров уже перевели. Он будет один. The passengers have already been moved. He will be alone." Whitmore stared at her. "You speak Russian?" he asked in Russian. Her face brightened with urgency. She answered in the same language. "Duh. Yes. How?" he asked, switching back to English. "I sit with my grandma at the cafe every day," she said quickly. "Lots of Russian pilots stop there. They talk. They think I don't understand. I listen." It was plausible. Chicago's executive aviation corridor served international charter routes. Russian crews rotated through more often than most people realized. Whitmore studied her carefully. There was no hesitation in her grammar, no guessing. "Say it again," he said quietly. She repeated the first sentence in Russian without stumbling. 10 minutes in the air, we activate." His gaze shifted slowly toward the cockpit. From this angle, he could see the captain's silhouette behind the tinted glass. The man appeared to be adjusting something near the console. Whitmore's assistant called again. He declined the call. "Who else heard this?" he asked Annie. "No one," she said. "I was near the maintenance hallway. He had your picture." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "My picture?" She nodded rapidly. He took it out of his jacket. "And they said if you survive, there's a second plan." Second plan. That phrase settled heavily in his mind. He had learned long ago that real threats did not announce themselves dramatically. They embedded themselves in routine. He looked at the aircraft more carefully now. Something was off. There were fewer ground technicians around the rear service panel than normal. Standard departure protocol required visible clearance checks. Today, the perimeter looked sparse. He turned back to Annie. "Point to him," he said calmly. She lifted her small hand and pointed directly toward the cockpit window. "There." Whitmore switched back to Russian and raised his voice slightly. "Капитан, выйдите, пожалуйста." "Captain, step out, please." There was a delay, a subtle one, but noticeable. Whitmore felt the shift in the air around him. His security chief leaned closer. "Sir." Whitmore did not take his eyes off the aircraft. "When did you hear this?" he asked Annie. Just now. In the hallway, the captain finally appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked composed. Too composed. Whitmore's instincts, sharpened by years of risk assessment, aligned with what the little girl had said. 10 minutes. Activate. Passengers moved. Alone. He stepped completely away from the stairway. Hold departure, he said quietly to his security chief. Sir, we're cleared for hold departure. The tone left no room for debate. He crouched slightly so he was closer to Annie's height. You're certain about the words? He asked in Russian. She nodded firmly. Очень уверена. Very certain. Whitmore stood. Ground control, he ordered. Lock down the aircraft. No one boards. No one disembarks without clearance. The engines continued to hum, but the rhythm of the moment had changed. His assistant's phone call buzzed again in his pocket. He ignored it. For the first time that afternoon, Michael Whitmore did not see a child out of place in a restricted zone. He saw the only person in the terminal who had been paying attention. The engines had not yet powered down completely when Annie saw it. Not the device, she didn't know where that would be. Not yet. She saw the movement. The co-pilot. He emerged from the side stair hatch instead of the main cockpit steps, moving quickly along the far edge of the fuselage, head slightly lowered, one hand gripping a small black flight bag too tightly. Everyone else's attention was on the captain standing stiffly near Michael Whitmore. Everyone except Annie. Her small fingers tightened around Whitmore's hand. He's leaving, she whispered urgently. Whitmore's focus had been locked on the captain's face, measuring tone, posture, breath control. But Annie's voice cut through the analysis. Who? He asked without turning. The other one, she said, pointing. The second pilot. He wasn't supposed to go that way. Whitmore's gaze shifted. 30 yards away. The co-pilot was walking fast, too fast for someone whose aircraft was merely undergoing a precautionary review. Ruiz, Whitmore said calmly. His head of security followed the direction of Annie's finger. I see him. The co-pilot broke into a quicker stride when he noticed security eyes on him. That was all Whitmore needed. Stop him, Ruiz ordered into his earpiece. 2 airport officers moved to intercept. The co-pilot hesitated, pivoted slightly as if reconsidering direction, then forced a tight smile as they approached. Gentlemen, he began. Is there a problem? Whitmore did not look away from him. There it is, he thought. The fracture. The captain, still standing near the stairs, shifted his weight. Whitmore turned back to him slowly. They locked eyes, and Whitmore switched languages. «Почему ваш второй пилот покидает самолет?» he asked evenly. Why is your co-pilot leaving the aircraft? The captain's pupils narrowed just slightly. He's retrieving paperwork, he answered in Russian. Too quick. Whitmore did not blink. Показывайте, he replied. Show me. The captain hesitated. Annie felt the tension, though she did not fully understand the words now being exchanged. The air had changed, grown heavier, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Security escorted the co-pilot back toward the aircraft. He no longer looked relaxed. Whitmore kept his voice measured. «Вы говорили по радио в коридоре обслуживания», he said. 10 минут в воздухе. You were speaking on the radio in the maintenance corridor. 10 minutes in the air. The captain's composure cracked for the briefest instant. I don't know what this is about, he replied in Russian, but the cadence had shifted. Defensive, strained. Whitmore stepped closer. She understood you, he said, nodding toward Annie. She heard everything. The captain's gaze flicked downward just once to the child, and that single glance was enough, because it wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Whitmore saw it clearly. He lowered his voice. Кто вам заплатил? Who paid you? Silence. The co-pilot swallowed visibly. Airport police tightened their hold. Whitmore's phone vibrated again in his pocket. He ignored it. Пассажиров перевели. Whitmore continued. Он будет один. Это были ваши слова. Passengers were moved. He will be alone. Those were your words. The captain's jaw tightened. That was out of context, he muttered. Какой контекст оправдывает это? Whitmore asked sharply. What context justifies that? Annie watched Whitmore's face. It was no longer skeptical. It was cold, controlled. The co-pilot suddenly spoke, voice shaking. We were told the route was adjusted for security, he said in English. We followed instructions. Whitmore's eyes snapped to him. Whose instructions? The co-pilot hesitated. The captain shot him a warning look. Too late. The co-pilot's gaze darted toward Whitmore's phone, the one still buzzing intermittently in his pocket. Whitmore felt it before he processed it. His assistant. Another vibration. Another call. Ruiz noticed too. "Sir," he murmured. Whitmore slowly removed the phone from his pocket. On the screen, 12 missed calls, all from the same name. Evan Keller, his executive assistant. The man who had just been insisting he board immediately. Whitmore looked up again, this time not at the pilots but at the pattern. Moved passengers. 10-minute activation window. Relentless pressure to depart on schedule. He spoke in Russian again, quieter now. "Это было организовано через мой офис?" Was this arranged through my office? The captain did not answer, but the co-pilot's silence was louder than denial. Whitmore stepped closer until he stood directly in front of the captain. "Кто координировал расписание?" he asked. "Who coordinated the schedule?" The captain's lips parted, and then he made the mistake. "Мы получили подтверждение от мистера Келлера," he said automatically. "We received confirmation from Mr. Keller." The moment the name left his mouth, he froze. So did everyone else. Whitmore did not move, but something inside him shifted. Evan Keller had worked beside him for 8 years. If this moment moved you, if you felt that quiet shift when trust turned into betrayal, take a second, right now. Like this video, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and share your thoughts on what you would have done in Whitmore's place. And if stories about justice, loyalty, and hidden truth matter to you, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Handled schedules, cleared flights, managed secure communications, and today had been urgently pushing for takeoff. Annie watched Whitmore's face carefully. He didn't shout, didn't accuse. He simply absorbed the information like a man recalculating a threat model in real time. "You just implicated my assistant," Whitmore said in English, voice flat. The captain shook his head quickly. I only meant we were cleared through your office." Whitmore turned to Ruiz. "Detain both of them," he said quietly. Ruiz nodded. The co-pilot began to protest, but it was weak now. Whitmore's phone vibrated again. He answered this time. "Keller," he said. "Michael." Evan's voice came fast, controlled but strained. "What's happening?" "The FAA is asking questions. You need to get in the air. This delay is creating exposure." Whitmore looked at the grounded aircraft, at the detained pilots, at Annie. "Tell me something," Whitmore said calmly. "Who authorized the passenger transfer?" There was the smallest pause. "A routine load adjustment," Keller replied. Whitmore switched to Russian mid-sentence. "Вы уверены? Are you sure?" Silence. On the other end of the line, Keller did not respond immediately. He did not understand Russian. Whitmore's suspicions solidified. He returned to English. "We'll discuss this when I'm back," he said. He ended the call. The sky above the runway remained clear and deceptively calm. Whitmore looked down at Annie. "You did more than you know," he said quietly, because this was no longer just about a device. It was about betrayal, from inside his own circle, the kind of betrayal that does not shout. It schedules, it pressures, it insists on punctuality, and it hopes no one is listening. The sirens arrived without drama. No flashing spectacle, no shouting. Just the steady authority of federal response vehicles rolling across polished concrete toward the private hangar. Michael Whitmore stood still as TSA agents secured the aircraft perimeter, and airport police escorted both pilots away. The captain's composure had fully dissolved now. The co-pilot avoided eye contact entirely. Annie remained beside Whitmore, her small hand no longer gripping his, but hovering close as if unsure whether she still needed to hold on. Ruiz approached quietly. "FBI's en route. Bomb Squad 2. Whitmore nodded. He watched technicians wheel a containment cart toward the open service panel beneath the fuselage. The device inside was no longer hypothetical. It was real, physical, cold, 10 minutes in the air. Activate. He closed his eyes briefly. If Annie had hesitated, if she had decided she was just a kid, if she had believed the adults who brushed her aside, he exhaled slowly and opened his eyes again. Across the tarmac, the co-pilot stumbled slightly as officers guided him forward. "Sir," Ruiz added in a lower tone, "we're pulling airport surveillance from the maintenance corridor." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "Do it." Annie shifted her weight. "Am I in trouble?" she asked softly. Whitmore looked down at her. "No," he said immediately. You're the reason we're all standing here. She absorbed that quietly. For 6 years, most rooms had treated her as background noise. A child at a cafe counter. A pair of listening ears no one accounted for. Now federal agents were stepping around her carefully. An unmarked black SUV rolled to a stop near the aircraft. 2 FBI agents stepped out mid-40s, composed, practical suits, the kind of men who had seen enough human weakness not to be surprised by it anymore. Special Agent Marcus Hale introduced himself with a brief nod. Mr. Whitmore, Hale. They shook hands quickly. We've secured both pilots, Hale said. Explosive ordnance team is assessing the device. Whitmore gestured toward Annie. She heard the coordination. Hale's eyes softened slightly as he crouched to Annie's level. You're Annie? He asked. She nodded. Can you tell me what you heard? She repeated it again, steady now. The Russian phrases, the timing, the mention of passenger transfer. The second plan. Hale listened carefully. Did you recognize either voice? He asked. The first one was the captain, she said. The second one I didn't see. Hale nodded. That's very brave. Annie glanced up at Whitmore, as if checking whether that word fit. Whitmore felt something tighten in his chest. He had built a career on anticipating sophisticated threats, state actors, cyber warfare, encrypted sabotage. He had not anticipated that the first crack in today's plot would come from a 6-year-old sitting behind a grilled cheese counter. Ruiz approached again, holding a tablet. Sir. Surveillance from the corridor. Whitmore stepped aside with him. The grainy footage showed the captain speaking into a handheld radio near the maintenance door. The co-pilot stood nearby. After a moment, a third figure entered the frame, briefly back-turned, face partially obscured. Whitmore froze. He knew that posture, the stance, the angle of the shoulders. Evan Keller, his assistant, the man who had handled every schedule clearance for nearly a decade. Whitmore's face did not change, but Ruiz saw the recognition. Sir? Whitmore kept his voice level. Send that to Agent Hale. Ruiz nodded. Whitmore turned back toward the aircraft. The bomb squad technician emerged from beneath the fuselage. It's live, the technician confirmed. Remote detonation trigger configured to altitude threshold. Altitude threshold, exactly as Annie had said. Whitmore felt a cold wave move through him, not fear, but clarity. Keller's urgency to depart. Passenger transfers arranged quietly through the executive office. Pilots referencing confirmation from Mr. Keller. And now surveillance placing Keller near the maintenance corridor. The betrayal was no longer abstract. It was structured. He stepped away from the noise and called Keller again. The line connected immediately. Michael, Keller said, voice controlled but slightly strained. The agencies are escalating this unnecessarily. We need to manage optics. Whitmore looked across the tarmac where FBI agents were placing evidence markers. Evan, he said evenly, why were you in the maintenance corridor 20 minutes ago? There was silence. A long one. I wasn't, Keller replied carefully. Whitmore switched briefly into Russian, a reflex now when testing for hesitation. Vous uверены? Are you certain? Keller didn't understand. What? Keller asked. Whitmore returned to English. I have footage, he said. Another pause. Then Keller tried a different tactic. Michael, listen to me. You're under pressure right now. Let's not make assumptions. Did you authorize passenger transfers? Whitmore interrupted. Yes, Keller admitted. For safety reasons. It simplified the manifest. For whose safety? Silence again. Whitmore's voice lowered. Who paid you? On the other end. Keller inhaled sharply. That's a dangerous accusation. Whitmore ended the call without another word. He stood very still for several seconds. Around him, agents moved efficiently. The device was being secured inside a blast-resistant container. The pilots were read their rights. Statements were being taken. Annie watched it all quietly. She walked closer. Is it over? She asked. Whitmore looked down at her. No, he said honestly. But it stopped. He crouched again, eye level. You didn't just save a flight, he told her. You exposed something much bigger. She frowned slightly. I just listened, she said. Whitmore almost smiled. Listening. In boardrooms, people spoke over each other. In negotiations, everyone tried to dominate the room. But today, the smallest person had simply listened. Agent Hale approached again. We're issuing a warrant for Keller, he said quietly. based on coordination evidence and financial anomalies tied to a defense competitor. Whitmore nodded. It was unfolding faster than he expected, but not faster than it could have ended. He looked once more at the aircraft. White fuselage, clean lines, a machine built for altitude. 10 minutes. That was all it would have taken. He straightened and turned to Annie. "Let's go find your grandmother," he said, because there was something he needed to say to a woman who had raised a child capable of interrupting a billionaire's schedule to tell the truth. And for the first time in years, Michael Whitmore felt something unfamiliar pressing against his carefully constructed composure. Not anger, not strategy, gratitude. Martha Johnson was wiping down the counter for the third time in 10 minutes when she saw the flashing lights through the glass wall of the terminal. Not frantic lights, controlled ones. Still, her stomach dropped. Airports did not attract quiet emergencies. She stepped away from the register and craned her neck toward the private aviation wing. Uniformed officers moved with purposeful speed. A small crowd had formed at a respectful distance. "Lord, please," she murmured under her breath. Annie had gone to find a pen. That had been 15 minutes ago. Martha dried her hands on her apron and stepped out from behind the counter. "Can you watch the register?" she asked the newsstand clerk. The woman nodded, eyes also fixed on the scene unfolding across the terminal. Martha walked quickly, faster than her knees preferred, toward the security barrier separating public space from the executive tarmac. An officer blocked her gently. "Ma'am, this area is temporarily restricted. My granddaughter is back there," Martha said, trying to keep her voice steady. "She's 6. Annie Johnson. She was just here." Before the officer could respond, a familiar, deep voice carried across the terminal. "She's with me." Michael Whitmore stepped into view, Annie walking beside him. Martha froze. Even if she had never watched financial news, she would have recognized him. His face appeared on magazine covers and airport televisions often enough, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Annie. Martha dropped to her knees and pulled the girl into a tight embrace. "Annie Louise Johnson," she whispered fiercely. "You do not run off like that." Annie buried her face into her grandmother's shoulder. "I'm sorry," she said. "I had to." Martha pulled back slightly and looked at her granddaughter's face. No tears, just seriousness. Then she looked up at Whitmore. "Sir," she began cautiously. Whitmore inclined his head. "Mrs. Johnson," he said. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. He knew her name. "She saved my life," he added calmly. Martha blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Whitmore did not dramatize it. "There was an explosive device attached to my aircraft," he said. "Your granddaughter overheard the coordination in Russian and warned me before takeoff." The words seemed to hang in the air between them. Martha looked at Annie again, searching her face. "You understood them?" she asked softly. Annie nodded. "They talk at the cafe all the time," she said. "The Russian crews. They think I'm just coloring." Martha exhaled slowly. She had always known Annie listened more than people realized. The airport cafe had become their classroom in unexpected ways. Pilots, mechanics, businessmen from Moscow and St. Petersburg passed through weekly. Annie absorbed languages the way other children absorbed cartoons. Whitmore watched the exchange quietly. Around them, FBI agents continued their work. The aircraft was being towed away from the gate. The pilots were no longer visible. "Mrs. Johnson," Whitmore said carefully, "I owe your granddaughter more than gratitude." Martha stood slowly. "Sir, with respect, she just told the truth." Whitmore's expression shifted slightly. "Yes," he said, "and that is rarer than it should be." Agent Hale approached and handed Whitmore a tablet. "Keller's been detained," Hale said quietly. "Financial records show offshore transfers tied to one of your competitors." He coordinated the flight manifest adjustment and pressured for immediate departure. Whitmore nodded once. Betrayal confirmed. He did not show anger. Not here. Not in front of Annie. Martha watched the exchange carefully. "You trusted him," she said softly. Whitmore met her eyes. "For 8 years." She gave a small, knowing nod. "I was a teacher for 35, she said. "The hardest lessons aren't in books." Whitmore considered that. He had built firewalls against hackers, encryption against espionage, contracts against competition. He had not built protection against proximity, against someone sitting 3 feet from him in a glass office every day. Annie tugged gently on Martha's sleeve. "Grandma, am I in trouble?" Martha knelt again. "Baby, You are never in trouble for telling the truth. Whitmore felt those words land heavily. Never in trouble for telling the truth. How many adults believe that? He looked down at Annie. Can I ask you something? He said. She nodded. Were you scared? She hesitated. Yes. Why didn't you walk away? Annie thought about it seriously. Because they thought no one understood, she said. And if I didn't say it, then they'd win. Whitmore inhaled slowly. If I didn't say it, they'd win. He had spent years telling congressional panels that silence in cybersecurity allowed threats to multiply. And yet, in his own life, he had grown accustomed to efficiency over attention. Martha straightened. Sir, she said gently. She's just a child. Whitmore shook his head slightly. She's more observant than most executives I've met. A faint, reluctant smile touched Martha's lips. An airport announcement crackled overhead, rerouting flights around the temporary security hold. Life was resuming its rhythm. Whitmore looked at the cafe sign behind them. Martha's Kitchen. Simple. Hand-painted. How long have you had the lease? He asked. 3 years, Martha replied. Is it stable? She gave a short, practical laugh. It keeps the lights on. Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. Behind him, Ruiz approached. Sir, press inquiries are escalating. Whitmore glanced toward the windows where reporters were beginning to gather at a distance. He turned back to Martha and Annie. I won't use her name publicly, he said. She deserves privacy. Martha's shoulders relaxed slightly. Thank you. Whitmore extended his hand toward Annie again, not to lead her this time, but to shake it. She placed her small hand in his. You listened, he said quietly. She shrugged. You did too. The simplicity of it unsettled him in a way boardroom negotiations never had. He had listened eventually, because she forced him to, because she refused to stay invisible. Agent Hale stepped closer once more. We'll need formal statements, he said. Martha nodded. We'll cooperate. Whitmore looked at the runway one last time. The sky remained clear, but something inside him had shifted permanently. Trust, he realized, was not maintained by control. It was protected by attention, and attention sometimes comes from the smallest voice in the room. By the time the formal statements were completed, the airport had settled into an uneasy version of normal. Flights resumed. Announcements continued. Coffee machines hissed. But in a secured conference room overlooking the private runway, the air felt heavier. Michael Whitmore sat at the head of the polished oak table, hands folded, expression controlled. Across from him sat Assistant Director Keller, no longer composed, no longer efficient. 2 federal agents stood behind him. Annie and Martha were seated near the far end of the room, a quiet presence. Agent Hale had insisted they remain while the timeline was clarified. Keller's tie was loosened now. Sweat had gathered along his collar despite the cool air. You're making a catastrophic mistake, Keller said, his voice tight. This is circumstantial. Whitmore did not raise his voice. The explosives were real. Keller swallowed. That doesn't prove I ordered anything. Whitmore switched to Russian without warning. Ty zabil одну вещь. You forgot one thing. Keller flinched. Whitmore continued smoothly. Я понимаю всё. I understand everything. Annie looked up sharply. Martha felt her granddaughter's hand tighten around hers. Whitmore leaned forward slightly. You coordinated the crew reassignment, he said in Russian. You insisted on my presence on that specific aircraft. You delayed departure twice this week, waiting for optimal conditions. Keller's jaw clenched. You've been under pressure, Keller replied, also in Russian now, trying to regain footing. Competitors circle. Weakness invites collapse. Whitmore's gaze hardened. Loyalty is not weakness. Silence filled the room. Agent Hale placed a printed document in front of Whitmore. Wire transfers confirmed, Hale said. Offshore accounts tied to Keller's brother-in-law. Payments originating from Halvorsen Aerospace. Whitmore did not react outwardly. Halvorsen. The name had hovered at the edges of corporate rivalry for years. You sold access, Whitmore said quietly, returning to English. Not to destroy my company. To remove me. Keller exhaled sharply. It wasn't personal. Whitmore almost smiled at that. It always is. Across the table, Annie studied Keller's face, not with fear, with curiosity. She leaned toward her grandmother and whispered, He thought nobody would notice. Martha nodded gently. That's how pride works, she murmured. Whitmore heard that. He turned his gaze toward Annie. "Do you know something?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "I just saw how he looked at the plane," she said, like it already belonged to someone else. The room went still. Agent Hale exchanged a glance with Ruiz. Children did not often articulate betrayal so cleanly. Whitmore stood slowly. "For 8 years," he said, his voice measured. "I trusted you with my calendar, my security briefings, my private meetings. You attended family funerals with me." Keller's composure cracked. "You built walls," Keller snapped. "You treated everyone like a potential liability." "I adapted." Whitmore's eyes did not leave him. "No," he said quietly. "You exploited." 2 agents stepped forward. Keller was escorted from the room without further protest. The door closed with a soft click. Silence lingered. Whitmore remained standing for a long moment. Then he turned toward Annie and Martha. "I owe you transparency," he said. Martha raised a hand gently. "You owe us nothing beyond honesty." Whitmore nodded. "Then honesty it is." Keller believed removing me would trigger a hostile takeover. He miscalculated 2 things. "Which?" Annie asked. Whitmore looked at her. "That I speak Russian," he said, "and that a 6-year-old would be braver than a room full of executives." Annie blinked. "I was just loud." Whitmore's expression softened slightly. "Sometimes loud is necessary." He walked toward the window overlooking the runway. Aircraft moved in precise choreography against the fading afternoon light. "I built my company on anticipation," he continued. "Threat detection, pattern recognition, risk modeling." He turned back toward them, "And I missed the simplest pattern. Resentment sitting across from me every morning." Martha stood slowly. "Resentment grows in silence," she said. "And silence grows when people feel unseen." Whitmore absorbed that. Unseen. The word lingered. He looked at Annie again. "How many times have you sat in that cafe while grown men spoke over you?" he asked. She shrugged. "All the time." "And you listened?" She nodded. "I like listening." Whitmore let out a slow breath. "I used to," he said quietly. Agent Hale approached. "Sir, media is requesting a statement." Whitmore considered. "No details," he said. "Internal security matter. Emphasize safety protocols worked." Hale nodded and left. Martha gathered her purse. "We should get back," she said gently. "Dinner doesn't cook itself." Whitmore hesitated. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "may I ask something personal?" She paused. "You may. Why did you teach her to listen so closely?" Martha smiled faintly. "I didn't," she said. "Life did. When you raise a child in a world that doesn't always see her, you teach her to observe. Observation becomes armor." Whitmore felt that settled deeply. Armor. He had built his from power. Annie's was built from attention. He walked with them toward the corridor leading back to the public terminal. The tension of crisis had faded, replaced by something steadier, reflection. As they reached the cafe entrance, Annie turned. "Mr. Dunn." "Whitmore?" "Yes." "Are you going to fly tomorrow?" He considered the question seriously. "Yes," he said, "but with different people." She nodded approvingly. "Good." Martha squeezed Annie's shoulder. Whitmore watched them step back into their ordinary world, the smell of coffee, the hum of travelers, the simple dignity of routine. For the first time in years, he did not feel above it. He felt connected to it. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed with a message from the board. "Emergency session scheduled. Leadership continuity plan activated." Whitmore typed a brief reply. "No change in leadership. Rebuilding trust begins now." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Trust was not a memo. It was a practice, and it had begun with a child who refused to stay quiet. The story broke at 6:12 p.m., not with Annie's name, not with details about Russian transmissions or altitude-triggered detonators, just a controlled headline scrolling across cable news banners in airport lounges and suburban living rooms. "Whitmore jet incident thwarted internal security breach under investigation." Michael Whitmore stood alone in his office overlooking the city skyline as the muted television replayed footage of federal vehicles at the private hangar. He watched himself from a distance, calm, controlled, walking beside agents. No one on television could see the 6-year-old who had forced that calm into existence. He preferred it that way. His phone buzzed again. Board members, investors, defense contacts, questions layered inside questions. But one message stood out, from Martha Johnson. We're closing early tonight. Annie is tired. Thank you for protecting her name. Whitmore read it twice. Protecting her name. He had spent decades protecting his own reputation like a fortress. Tonight, he felt more protective of something far smaller. He replied simply, "She protected mine first." Across town, in a modest apartment above a grocery store, Annie sat at the small kitchen table swinging her legs, while Martha stirred a pot of chicken and dumplings. The television was off. Martha preferred quiet after a long day. Annie colored carefully inside the lines of a picture she had drawn, a plane in the sky, but with a small speech bubble near the wing that said, "Listen, Grandma," Annie asked softly, "are bad people always close by?" Martha set down the spoon and turned off the burner. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "but so are good ones." Annie considered that. "Mr. Whitmore looked sad," she added. Martha walked over and pulled out a chair. "When someone you trust breaks that trust," she said gently, "it feels like losing something you can't replace." "Like when Mama left?" Annie asked. Martha's throat tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Yes," she said. "Like that." Annie nodded slowly. She had been 4 when her mother died from a sudden aneurysm. No warning, no time to prepare. Loss had entered her life early. Perhaps that was why she recognized the look in Whitmore's eyes so quickly. Back in his high-rise office, Whitmore poured himself a glass of water and stared at the framed photographs on his desk. There were few. A graduation photo from Annapolis, a handshake with a former president, a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a cybersecurity research facility. All achievements, all formal, none personal. He opened a secure message from Agent Hale. "Keller is cooperating. Claims financial coercion. Halverson Aerospace denies involvement. Investigation expanding." Whitmore exhaled. Coercion. It was always easier to claim pressure than to admit ambition. He sat down slowly. For years, he had told young executives that leadership required emotional distance. Distance protected judgment. Distance prevented manipulation. Tonight, he saw the flaw. Distance also prevented connection. And connection was what Annie had relied on when she chose to shout instead of shrink. His office door opened quietly. Ruiz stepped inside. "Sir, the board wants reassurance before markets open tomorrow." Whitmore nodded. "They'll have it." Ruiz hesitated. "Sir, you okay?" Whitmore looked at him. Ruiz had been with him since his early days in defense contracting. Loyal. Steady. "Yes," Whitmore said after a moment. "But," recalibrating, Ruiz gave a faint smile. "That's a polite way to put it." Whitmore stood and walked to the window. The city lights flickered below like a living constellation. "I built detect invisible threats," he said quietly. "But I ignored the visible ones." "Problem." Ruiz didn't interrupt. Whitmore continued. "A 6-year-old saw what seasoned professionals dismissed." Ruiz nodded thoughtfully. "Kids notice what adults filter out." Whitmore folded his arms. "I don't want this company run on fear anymore," he said. Ruiz blinked. "Sir." Whitmore turned toward him. "Security isn't control, it's awareness. And awareness requires listening." Ruiz studied him carefully. "This about more than today?" "Yes." A pause. "You thinking structural changes?" Whitmore nodded slowly. "Background checks are procedures. Culture is prevention." Ruiz absorbed that. "People won't like change." Whitmore's expression remained calm. "People rarely do." Later that evening, Whitmore found himself scrolling through an old internal employee survey he had ignored months ago. Concerns about communication barriers, comments about executive inaccessibility, subtle warnings. He had skimmed them. Keller had summarized them and dismissed them. Whitmore closed the file. Justice, he realized, was not always loud. Sometimes it was simply the act of paying attention before harm required heroics. Across the city, Annie finished dinner and climbed into bed. Martha sat beside her and brushed her hair gently. "You were very brave," Martha said softly. Annie stared at the ceiling. "I didn't want him to die." Martha nodded. "That's called compassion." Annie turned her head. "Is that important?" Martha smiled. "It's everything." Annie closed her eyes. In her mind, she replayed the moment on the runway. The urgency, the doubt in Whitmore's face, the way he stopped when she switched to Russian. Words mattered. Being heard mattered. Before sleep claimed her, she whispered something barely audible. "I'm glad he listened." Back in his office, Whitmore finally turned off the television. He picked up his phone and drafted a brief internal message to senior leadership. Tomorrow we begin a full audit not only of security protocols, but of communication culture. No voice is too small to register concern. If we want loyalty, we must practice integrity. He hesitated only a second before pressing send. Then he did something unexpected. He opened his calendar, cleared 2 hours for the following afternoon, and typed a new entry: visit Martha's kitchen. He stared at the words for a long moment. For years, his calendar had been a battlefield of negotiations, acquisitions, and classified briefings. Now it held something different. Intention. He turned off the lights and left the office. The city continued moving. Markets would open in the morning. Investigations would unfold. Competitors would posture. But somewhere in a small apartment, a 6-year-old slept peacefully because she had chosen to speak. And for the first time in a long while, Michael Whitmore felt that perhaps the most powerful security system in the world was not built from algorithms or armed guards. It was built from courage. The next afternoon, Michael Whitmore arrived at the airport without a motorcade. No press. No advanced security sweep beyond the standard rotation Ruiz insisted on maintaining. He walked through the public terminal like any other traveler, navy blazer, open collar, no tie. People recognized him, of course. A few discreet glances. A couple of murmured confirmations, but he kept walking until he reached the small corner cafe tucked between a newsstand and Gate 14, Martha's Kitchen. The hand-painted sign looked even more modest in daylight. Inside, the scent of fresh cornbread and brewed coffee wrapped around him like something older than corporate ambition. Martha stood behind the counter, tying off a plastic bag for a customer. She looked up. There was no surprise in her eyes, just assessment. "Mr. Whitmore," she said calmly. "Mrs. Johnson." He stepped aside to let a pair of travelers pass before approaching the counter. "Grilled cheese today?" she asked. He almost smiled. "That's what Annie recommended." Martha nodded toward a corner booth. "She's finishing homework." Whitmore turned. Annie sat with a workbook open in front of her, pencil tucked behind her ear, brow furrowed in concentration. Her tongue peeked out slightly as she worked through a math problem. For a moment, he simply watched. No urgency, no alarms, just a child being 6. He approached quietly. "What are we solving today?" he asked. Annie looked up, startled only for a split second before recognition dawned. "Word problems," she said seriously. "They're tricky because they hide the numbers inside sentences." Whitmore considered that. "Yes," he said softly. "They do." He slid into the booth across from her. Martha placed a plate and a mug of coffee in front of him. "No charge," she said firmly before he could protest. "You saved my granddaughter's life too." Whitmore met her eyes. "We saved each other," he replied. Martha gave a small nod and returned to the counter. Annie studied him for a moment. "Did they catch the man who helped the pilots?" she asked. Whitmore chose his words carefully. "Yes." "Was he your friend?" The question landed harder than any boardroom challenge. "He worked with me for a long time," Whitmore said. "I trusted him." Annie looked down at her workbook. "That hurts," she said simply. He took a slow breath. "Yes," he admitted. "It does." She tapped her pencil against the page. "Grandma says when someone shows you who they are, you should believe them the first time." Whitmore almost laughed softly. "Your grandmother is a wise woman." Annie glanced up. "Are you mad?" He thought about it. "I was," he said honestly. "Now I'm paying attention." She seemed satisfied with that. Across the cafe, 2 older men in travel jackets discussed baseball scores over coffee. A flight attendant ordered soup to go. Ordinary life layered over extraordinary events. Whitmore took a bite of the grilled cheese. Simple, warm, uncomplicated. He realized how long it had been since he'd eaten without multitasking. Annie leaned forward slightly. "Are you still going to fly?" she asked. "Yes." "Are you scared?" Whitmore considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Not of flying," he said. "But I'm more aware now." She nodded. "That's good." He studied her for a moment. "Annie," he said gently, "why do you think the pilots didn't think anyone would understand them?" She shrugged. "Because grown-ups don't think kids are listening." He let that settle. "How many things do adults miss because they assume they're the only ones in the room?" he murmured, almost to himself. Annie tilted her head. "Lots." Whitmore smiled faintly. At the counter, Martha watched them without interrupting. There was something almost surreal about seeing a man whose company protected national infrastructure sitting in a vinyl booth discussing arithmetic with her granddaughter. But what struck her most was not his status. It was his posture, leaning in, listening. After a few minutes, Whitmore reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small envelope on the table. Annie's eyes widened slightly. "What's that?" "Something for you and your grandmother," he said. Martha approached immediately. "Mr. Whitmore, it's not charity," he said gently. "It's investment." Martha folded her arms. "In what?" "In potential." He slid the envelope toward her instead. Inside was documentation establishing an educational trust in Annie's name. Full scholarship coverage through university. Language immersion programs. Mentorship access. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she read. "Sir, this is too much." Whitmore shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "What's too much is a child having to shout to be heard." Silence filled the small booth. Annie looked between them. "Does this mean more books?" she asked. Whitmore smiled. "As many as you want." She beamed. Martha blinked back unexpected tears. "You don't owe us this," she whispered. Whitmore's voice lowered. "I owe her more than I can repay. But this is a start." He hesitated, then added, "And I would like to fund improvements here. The cafe, equipment upgrades, lease security." Martha straightened slightly. "We built this ourselves, and you'll keep running it," he said quickly. "This isn't takeover. It's reinforcement." She studied him carefully. "You're changing," she observed. Whitmore didn't deny it. "Yes." Annie looked proud, as if she had personally overseen the transformation. "Grandma says people can choose who they become," she said. Whitmore met her gaze. "She's right." Outside the cafe window, planes taxied along the runway under a pale afternoon sky. Life continued. But inside that small corner of the terminal, something quieter and more powerful was unfolding. Trust, rebuilt not through contracts or surveillance, but through presence. Whitmore finished his coffee and stood. "I have a board meeting," he said reluctantly. Annie hopped off the booth seat. "Will you come back?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes." She nodded once, satisfied. As he walked away, Martha called after him. "Mr. Whitmore." He turned. "Thank you," she said, "not for the money, not for the trust, but for something deeper, for listening." Whitmore inclined his head. "Thank her," he replied, "because sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one that saves everything." The boardroom on the 42nd floor had always felt like a command center. Glass walls, polished steel, a table long enough to distance disagreement from consequence. Michael Whitmore stood at its head without notes. 12 board members watched him carefully. Some loyal, some cautious, a few calculating. On the screen behind him, a single word appeared. "Rebuild. We survived yesterday." Whitmore began evenly. "Not because our systems were flawless. Not because our leadership was infallible. We survived because someone outside this room refused to stay silent." A few members shifted slightly. "We have spent years investing in technology," he continued. "Firewalls, encryption, counterintelligence. But we neglected something fundamental." He paused. "Culture." One board member, Harold Benton, cleared his throat. Late 60s, former Navy, practical. "Michael, with respect, this was a targeted betrayal. One individual, we remove the cancer, we move forward." Whitmore met his gaze calmly. "Cancer doesn't grow in isolation." Silence followed. He tapped the remote. Employee survey excerpts filled the screen. Anonymous comments about communication barriers. Concerns dismissed. Fear of speaking up. "These were submitted 8 months ago," Whitmore said. Summarized, filed, ignored. Several eyes drifted toward the empty chair Keller once occupied during executive briefings. "We built a fortress," Whitmore continued. "But fortresses create blind spots." Benton folded his hands. "What are you proposing?" Whitmore didn't hesitate. "Structural transparency audits. Direct reporting channels bypassing executive filters. Leadership accessibility rotations." A younger board member frowned slightly. "That introduces vulnerability." Whitmore nodded. "Yes, it does." He stepped away from the podium. "Justice isn't convenient," he said quietly. "Integrity isn't efficient, but they are durable." The room absorbed that. Across town, Annie sat cross-legged on the floor of the cafe storage room. practicing Russian phrases from a small paperback grammar guide one of the flight attendants had given her months ago. Martha organized supply invoices nearby. "Grandma," Annie said, sounding out a phrase carefully. "Spravedlivost не всегда громкая." Martha smiled faintly. "What does that mean?" "Justice isn't always loud." Martha leaned against the counter. "That's a good sentence." Annie nodded seriously. "I think Mr. Whitmore understands that now." Back in the boardroom, Whitmore fielded questions for nearly an hour. Legal exposure, shareholder reassurance, market optics. He answered each calmly, but his tone carried something new. Not defensiveness, conviction. When the session ended, Benton lingered behind. "You've changed your footing," Benton observed. Whitmore gathered his folder. "I had to." Benton studied him for a moment. "Because of the incident?" Whitmore shook his head slightly. "Because of who stopped it?" Benton raised an eyebrow. Whitmore did not elaborate. Some transformations could not be explained in quarterly language. Later that evening, Whitmore returned to his office and found a small package waiting on his desk. No corporate seal, no courier stamp, just a handwritten note attached. "For your office. So you remember to listen, Annie." Inside was her drawing, a plane in the sky, a speech bubble near the wing that read, "Listen." Whitmore stood still for a long time. Then he removed the graduation photo from the center of his desk and replaced it with Annie's drawing. Not out of sentiment, out of alignment. His phone buzzed. "Agent Hale." "Keller has agreed to testify," Hale said. "Full cooperation. Halverson executives under federal scrutiny." Whitmore nodded. "Good, sir," Hale added. "Off the record, most CEOs would be focused on damage control." Whitmore looked at the drawing again. "Damage was controlled," he said. "Now we repair." He ended the call and sat down. For years, he had believed leadership required emotional insulation. Now he understood something different. It required moral proximity. Across the city, Martha locked up the cafe for the night. Annie walked beside her, holding her hand. "Grandma," she asked softly, "do you think Mr. Whitmore is lonely?" Martha considered the question. "I think powerful people often are," she said gently. "Why?" "Because they forget how to let others stand close." Annie squeezed her hand. "I think he's learning." Martha smiled. "So do I." The next morning, headlines shifted. Whitmore initiates culture audit following security incident. Commentators debated whether it was strategic repositioning or genuine reform. Whitmore ignored the commentary. Instead, he walked unannounced into a mid-level operations meeting and took a seat at the far end of the table. The room froze. He nodded once. "Continue." For the first time, engineers spoke directly without filtering their concerns through hierarchy. He listened, truly listened, and in that quiet act, something began to recalibrate inside the company. Not fear-based compliance, but cautious trust. That afternoon, he found himself back at the airport not for travel, but for presence. Annie was teaching an elderly Russian mechanic how to pronounce grilled cheese properly. The man laughed heartily, repeating the phrase with thick accent. Whitmore watched from a distance before approaching. "You're expanding diplomatic relations," he remarked lightly. Annie grinned. "He says I roll my R's better than him." Whitmore chuckled softly. "That's high praise." Martha handed him a cup of coffee. "You didn't have to come today," she said. "Yes," he replied simply. "I did." He looked around the small cafe. Travelers from different backgrounds sharing tables, voices layered in multiple languages. No one here assumed they were the only ones worth hearing. Whitmore took a slow sip of coffee. In boardrooms, people measured power by control. Here, power looked different. It looked like connection. And as Annie animatedly corrected the mechanic's pronunciation again, Whitmore realized something profound. The world did not need louder leaders. It needed leaders who listened before the explosion. The first subpoena hit the news cycle on a Monday morning. Halverson Aerospace executives questioned in Whitmore plot. The markets reacted predictably: sharp dips, speculative commentary, televised panels dissecting corporate warfare as if it were a sport. Michael Whitmore did not turn on the television. Instead, he stood in the cafeteria of his own headquarters, holding a tray like any other employee. Conversations quieted when he entered. He felt it, the subtle shift in air, authority walking into ordinary space. He chose a table near the middle of the room, not the corner, not the executive alcove behind glass. After a moment's hesitation, two mid-level analysts approached. "Sir," one of them said carefully. "May we?" Whitmore gestured to the seats. "Please." They sat. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then the younger analyst cleared her throat. "We wanted to say, thank you, for the reporting channel." Whitmore nodded once. "You used it?" "Yes, sir." "And?" She exchanged a glance with her colleague. "It works." Whitmore leaned back slightly. "Then keep using it." Across town, Annie was carefully arranging paper napkins into precise squares at the cafe counter. Martha watched her with mild amusement. "You don't have to fold everyone perfectly," she said. "I like it when things line up," Annie replied. Martha nodded. "Order makes you feel safe?" Annie considered that. "Yes." The airport televisions above the gate area replayed footage of federal agents escorting executives into black SUVs. Annie glanced up briefly. "Is that the other bad company?" she asked. "Yes," Martha said calmly. "It is." Annie went back to her napkins. "Do they feel scared like Mr. Whitmore did?" Martha paused. "Probably." Annie's voice was thoughtful. "Being scared doesn't mean you're bad." "No," Martha agreed. "But what you do with fear matters." Back in his office, Whitmore met with Agent Hale again. The investigation had deepened. Financial trails, encrypted communications, evidence of coordinated market manipulation. "Keller's testimony is holding," Hale said. "He claims Halvorsen leadership promised him a C-suite position after your removal." Whitmore absorbed that without visible reaction. "Ambition," he said quietly, "combined with resentment," Hale added. Whitmore nodded. "I gave him proximity to power," he said, "not purpose." Hale studied him. "That's an unusual distinction." "It shouldn't be." There was a knock at the door. Ruiz entered with a folder. "Sir, internal audit reports. Early findings show communication suppression patterns under Keller's management." Whitmore opened the folder. Anonymous complaints redirected. Meeting requests filtered out. Risk reports minimized. He closed it slowly. The betrayal was no longer emotional. It was architectural. That evening, Whitmore drove himself to the airport again. No driver. No press. The cafe was quieter than usual. Rain streaked the large terminal windows, muting the runway lights into blurred halos. Annie sat at the booth with a small stack of library books. Whitmore slid into the seat across from her. "What are we studying tonight?" he asked. "Courage," she replied, holding up a children's biography of Harriet Tubman. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "Big subject." "She was small, too," Annie said matter-of-factly. Martha brought over tea. "You're becoming a regular," she observed. Whitmore gave a faint smile. "I suppose I am." Annie leaned forward. "Did you fire more people today?" Whitmore chose honesty again. "Yes." "Does that make you feel powerful?" The question caught him slightly off guard. "No," he said after a moment. "It makes me feel responsible." She seemed to weigh that carefully. "That's better," she concluded. Whitmore looked at the rain-streaked glass. "I used to think leadership meant staying ahead," he said quietly. "Now I think it means staying accountable." Annie flipped a page in her book. Harriet said, "If you hear the dogs, keep going." Whitmore smiled faintly. "Wise advice." She looked up at him. "You heard the dogs," she said. "You just needed someone to point." The simplicity of her logic disarmed him again. Across the cafe, an older couple watched them quietly. The man leaned toward his wife. "That him?" he whispered. She nodded. "Looks different in person." "How?" She studied Whitmore's posture. Less distant. Whitmore did not notice them. He was focused on Annie. "Why do you think people betray?" he asked her gently. She thought about it seriously. "Because they want something faster than they're willing to wait for." He absorbed that. "Yes," he said softly. "That sounds right." Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Inside, the cafe lights hummed steadily. Safe, predictable, grounded. Whitmore glanced at Annie's drawing, now framed in a simple black frame on his phone screen. He had taken a photo of it earlier that day. "Listen." He realized something. Justice had begun the moment he paused on the runway. But restoration began here. At a small table, with grilled cheese and rain against glass, Agent Hale texted him a final update that evening. Federal indictments forthcoming. Halvorsen stock suspended pending investigation. Whitmore locked his phone and slipped it away. For once, market movement did not occupy his thoughts. Annie closed her book. "Grandma says storms clear the air," she said. Whitmore looked toward the runway, lights cutting through rain. She's right, and as thunder softened into steady rainfall, he understood something that no corporate seminar had ever taught him. Power protects assets, but character protects people, and sometimes the clearest voice guiding both belongs to a 6-year-old who refused to let silence win. The federal indictments came down on a Thursday, not with spectacle, but with precision. 3 Halverson Aerospace executives, 2 intermediaries, 1 disgraced assistant named Evan Keller, now formally charged with conspiracy, attempted murder, and corporate espionage. Michael Whitmore read the summary alone in his office. He did not feel triumph. He felt gravity. Justice had weight. It pressed on everyone involved, even the innocent. His phone vibrated with incoming calls, media, shareholders, defense partners, but he silenced it and stared instead at Annie's framed drawing on his desk. Listen. He had listened. And because of that, dozens of families were not planning funerals. Across the city, Annie sat in her first-grade classroom during reading circle. Her teacher, Mrs. Donnelly, held up a newspaper folded carefully to avoid the darker headlines. "Class," she said gently, "sometimes grown-ups make big mistakes, but sometimes other grown-ups fix them." Annie tilted her head. She recognized the photo, just a corner of the airport runway, and a blurred image of Mr. Whitmore stepping away from a plane. Her name was not mentioned. That made her happy. After school, Martha was waiting near the gate entrance as usual. "You were on the news again," she said softly when Annie approached. "I know," Annie replied. "But not really," Martha smiled. "That's the best kind." Back at headquarters, Whitmore stood before a smaller executive group. No presentation slides. No rehearsed statements. "Keller has entered a plea negotiation," he said calmly. "He will testify fully against Halvorsen leadership." A murmur moved through the room. Whitmore continued, "This is not a victory. It's a warning." He let that settle. "We were vulnerable because we confused hierarchy with loyalty. That ends now." One executive shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, some will see this as weakness." Whitmore's eyes sharpened. "Integrity is not weakness." Silence followed. He dismissed the group shortly after, but asked Ruiz to stay. When the room cleared, Whitmore leaned against the table. "Ruiz," he said quietly, "have I been difficult to work for?" Ruiz didn't answer immediately. "You've been demanding," he said finally. "Exacting. Distant." Whitmore nodded slowly. "And now?" Ruiz allowed himself a faint smile. "Now you're listening." That evening, Whitmore visited the cafe again, but this time, he arrived during the busiest hour. Travelers lined up. Coffee orders overlapped. Suitcases rolled past in steady rhythm. Annie stood on a small step stool behind the counter, carefully placing lids on soup containers. Whitmore waited his turn in line. When he reached the register, Martha raised an eyebrow. "Long day?" "Productive," he said. Annie peeked around her grandmother. "Did the bad company get in trouble?" "Yes." "Will they go to jail?" "Some of them." She nodded thoughtfully. "Is that justice?" Whitmore paused. "It's part of it." She considered that carefully. "What's the other part?" He looked around the cafe, the travelers, the workers, the quiet community, stitched together by shared space. "Learning," he said. "And changing." Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. A middle-aged man in a worn army jacket turned from the counter. "You're Whitmore, aren't you?" he asked. Whitmore nodded. The man studied him for a long moment. "My son flies commercial routes," he said quietly. "If that plane had gone up," he didn't finish. Whitmore met his gaze steadily. "It didn't," he said. The man extended his hand. "Thank you." Whitmore shook it firmly. "No," he replied. "Thank her." He gestured toward Annie. The man looked down at the small girl balancing soup containers. "You?" he asked gently. Annie shrugged. "I just yelled." The man's expression softened. "Sometimes that's enough." After the rush slowed, Whitmore sat in his usual booth. Rain had returned, tapping softly against the windows. Martha joined him with 2 cups of coffee. "You're carrying something heavy," she observed. Whitmore didn't deny it. "Accountability," he said. She nodded. "That's a good weight to carry." He studied her for a moment. "You raised her to be fearless." Martha shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "I raised her to know her voice matters." Whitmore looked at Annie, now reading at the counter between customers. "For years," he said softly. I believed strength meant not needing anyone. Martha smiled faintly. And now? Now I think strength means recognizing when you do. A comfortable silence settled between them. In the distance, a plane lifted off into the gray sky. Whitmore watched it climb steadily through the clouds. He felt no fear watching it, only awareness. Later that night, he returned home and opened a blank document on his laptop. Not a corporate memo, not a press statement, a personal journal entry. He began typing. Today I learned that justice begins in attention, that loyalty must be earned daily, that the smallest voice can redirect the largest machine. He paused, then added, and that listening may be the most powerful act of leadership. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. Somewhere across the city, Annie was asleep, unaware that her insistence had altered more than a flight path. It had altered a man. It had altered a corporation. And perhaps, in quiet ways no headline would capture, it had altered the culture of listening inside rooms that once ignored anything smaller than power. Whitmore turned off the lights. The investigation would continue. Trials would follow. Markets would stabilize. But the real work, the quieter work, had already begun. Because justice is not only about punishing betrayal, it is about preventing the next one. The courtroom was quieter than the airport had been. No engines, no rolling suitcases, no overlapping announcements. Just the measured shuffle of paperwork and the low hum of anticipation. Michael Whitmore sat in the second row, not at the prosecution table, not surrounded by counsel. He had declined the front position offered to him. This was not about optics. It was about witnessing. Evan Keller sat at the defense table, thinner now, shoulders slightly curved inward. The confidence that once filled boardrooms had drained into something smaller, something almost fragile. Annie was not there. Whitmore had made certain of that. Justice, he believed, did not require a 6-year-old to relive what she had already endured. Agent Hale took the stand first, outlining the chain of evidence. Encrypted messages, offshore transfers, coordination logs between Keller and Halvorsen executives. Clinical, precise. Then Keller himself stood. His voice lacked its former polish. I believed, Keller said, staring somewhere above the jury's heads, that Mr. Whitmore had built something too rigid, too centered on himself. I thought the company needed different leadership. The prosecutor didn't blink. So you planted a bomb? Keller swallowed. I didn't build it, but you facilitated it. A pause. Yes, Whitmore felt no surge of anger, only a quiet recognition of how ambition, once untethered from principle, corrodes everything it touches. Later, outside the courthouse, reporters clustered along barricades. Whitmore stepped briefly toward the microphones. I will not comment on sentencing, he said calmly. I will say this corporate rivalry must never cross into human harm. Accountability is not revenge. It is responsibility. He stepped away before more questions could follow. Across town, Annie was at the cafe helping Martha label fresh pies for the display case. Why are there so many cameras downtown? Annie asked. Because grown-ups are finishing a hard conversation, Martha replied gently. Annie nodded. Did Mr. Whitmore have to talk? Yes. Was he scared? Martha smiled faintly. Probably. Annie thought about that. Grandma, she said quietly, is justice when someone says sorry? Martha set down the pie server. Justice is when truth is told, she answered. Sorry is just the beginning. That afternoon, Whitmore returned to the airport, not out of routine, but necessity. He needed something steady. Martha handed him coffee without asking. It's done? She asked. Almost, he said. Annie looked up from her spelling worksheet. Did the bad man say sorry? Whitmore paused before answering. Yes. Did he mean it? He considered Keller's expression on the stand. I don't know, he admitted. Sometimes people don't understand what they've broken until it's too late. Annie frowned slightly. That's sad. It is. She tapped her pencil thoughtfully. But you're still here. Whitmore smiled faintly. Yes, he said. I am. A pair of older travelers seated nearby were discussing the trial in hushed tones. Corporate greed, one muttered. World's gotten colder, the other replied. Whitmore heard them. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he looked at Annie. Do you think people are mostly good? He asked her quietly. She didn't hesitate. Yes. Even the bad ones? She tilted her head. They just forget. Martha watched him absorb that. For a man trained to analyze threat matrices and strategic vulnerabilities, the The simplicity of Annie's worldview might have seemed naive once. Now it felt clarifying. Later that evening, the verdict was announced. Guilty, conspiracy, attempted murder, corporate sabotage. Sentencing would follow in weeks. Whitmore read the alert on his phone while sitting in the cafe booth. He locked the screen and slipped it away. Annie noticed. "Is it finished?" she asked. For now, she slid out of the booth and walked around the table without a word. Then she hugged him. Not tentative, not formal, just certain. Whitmore stiffened for half a second, an old reflex, before allowing his arms to close gently around her small shoulders. He felt it again, that crack in his chest, the place where distance used to live. "Grandma says people can change," Annie murmured against his jacket. Whitmore swallowed. "I hope so," he said quietly. Martha turned away politely, giving them privacy. Outside the terminal windows, dusk settled over the runway in soft amber light. Planes continued to depart. Passengers continued to arrive. Life did not pause for verdicts, but something inside Whitmore had settled. Not satisfaction, resolution. Justice had been spoken in a courtroom, but transformation had begun on a runway when a child chose to shout. As Annie returned to her seat, she picked up her pencil again. "I have spelling words tomorrow," she said matter-of-factly. Whitmore smiled. "What's the hardest one?" "Responsibility." He nodded slowly. "That's an important word." She grinned. "I can spell it." He believed her, because she had already lived it. As the cafe lights glowed warmer against the fading evening sky, Whitmore realized something quietly profound. The trial had concluded a chapter of accountability, but the deeper work, the daily, patient work of listening, of choosing integrity over ego, would continue long after headlines faded, and he intended to continue it. Not because he owed the public, not because he feared competition, but because a 6-year-old had reminded him that justice is not just something enforced by courts, it is something practiced by people. Sentencing day arrived under a pale winter sky. Snow clung to the courthouse steps in thin, stubborn patches, refusing to melt despite the salt scattered across the concrete. Reporters gathered again, though fewer this time. The drama had cooled, the headlines had moved on. Michael Whitmore entered through a side door. He had considered not attending. Justice would proceed without him. But leadership, he had learned, sometimes meant showing up not to speak, not to dominate the frame, but to acknowledge weight. Inside the courtroom, Evan Keller stood straighter than before. Not defiant, not broken, simply aware. The judge's voice was steady, deliberate. Ambition does not excuse violence. Corporate rivalry does not justify murder. The sentence was substantial. Years, not months. A ripple of murmurs passed through the gallery. Whitmore did not react outwardly. He watched Keller nod once, just once, before being led away. No eye contact, no final exchange. Closure, Whitmore realized, rarely arrives with music swelling in the background. It arrives quietly. Across town, Annie was at school, presenting her show-and-tell project. She held up a small poster board with carefully written words in both English and Russian. "Listen slushai." Mrs. Donnelly smiled gently. "And why did you choose that word, Annie?" Annie shifted her weight. "Because listening can stop bad things before they start." The classroom fell unusually quiet. Children understood more than adults often gave them credit for. Later that afternoon, Whitmore arrived at the cafe carrying no briefcase, just himself. Martha saw it immediately. "It's finished," she said softly. "Yes." She studied his face. "You don't look relieved." He considered that. "I feel responsible to do better." Martha nodded. "That's a healthy feeling." Annie ran from the booth toward him. "I got an A on my spelling test." Whitmore smiled. "Let me guess. Responsibility?" She grinned proudly. "Responsibility. Perfect," he said. She beamed. The airport buzzed around them with pre-holiday travel energy. Families reunited. Soldiers embraced. Business travelers rushed past with tired determination. Whitmore sat down at the booth. "For a long time," he said quietly to Martha, "I measured success by expansion, contracts, acquisitions, market dominance. And now?" she asked. "Now I'm measuring by impact." Annie tilted her head. "What's impact?" Whitmore thought carefully. "It's what changes because you were there." She seemed satisfied with that. Martha poured him coffee. "You've been different since that day," she observed. Whitmore nodded. I built systems to detect external threats, he said, but I ignored internal erosion. Martha leaned against the counter. Trust doesn't collapse all at once, she said. It erodes quietly. He looked at Annie, now carefully drawing a new picture. What are you working on? He asked. A building, she said. What kind? A place where kids can come after school and learn stuff. Whitmore felt something stir. What kind of stuff? Languages? Math? Maybe flying? He smiled faintly. Flying? So they're not scared of planes, she replied simply. The idea lingered in the air longer than either of them expected. That evening, Whitmore returned to headquarters and called a special session with his philanthropic foundation board. I want to establish a community aviation and technology center, he said plainly. One board member blinked. In the city? No, Whitmore replied. At the airport. Silence. Why there? Another asked. Because that's where listening changed everything. He outlined the concept. After-school programs, language classes, STEM workshops, mentorship for children from working-class families, not branded with his name, not a publicity monument, a functional place, a steady place. The vote passed unanimously. Back at the cafe, Annie finished her drawing and slid it across the table to Martha. The building had big windows, and above the door, in bold letters, it read, The Listening Center. Martha smiled. That's a fine name. Annie looked up as Whitmore's text buzzed on Martha's phone. He sent a single photo, architectural sketches already in progress. Martha showed Annie. Her eyes widened. Is that real? Martha nodded slowly. I believe it will be. Annie's voice softened. Because we listened? Yes, Martha said gently. Because you did. Later that night, Whitmore stood alone on the observation deck overlooking the dark runway. Snowflakes drifted lightly through the floodlights. Planes moved in careful rhythm, guided by control towers, radar systems, and coordinated voices. He thought about systems again, about safeguards, about all the technology designed to prevent catastrophe. And yet, the most decisive safeguard that day had not been digital. It had been human, a child who understood a language others dismissed, a voice that refused to shrink. Whitmore slipped his hands into his coat pockets. He did not feel heroic. He felt accountable. He whispered something quietly into the cold air. Justice isn't loud. The wind carried the words away, but he knew they were true. Justice was not the verdict, not the sentence, not even the indictment. Justice had been the pause, the moment he chose to turn when a small voice called out, and as snow settled softly over the sleeping runway, Michael Whitmore understood something with clarity that no courtroom could provide. Power may command attention, but listening commands trust. Construction began in early spring, not with fanfare, not with ribbon cuttings or press releases, just the steady rhythm of trucks arriving before dawn, steel beams rising against a pale sky, and the smell of fresh lumber mixing with jet fuel drifting across the runway. The space sat just beyond the main terminal, close enough for children to watch planes take off, far enough to feel separate from the rush of travelers. Annie stood beside Martha at the temporary chain-link fence one Saturday morning, both bundled in light jackets against the lingering chill. Is that where the windows go? Annie asked, pointing to a wide rectangular frame outlined in steel. Yes, Martha replied. Big ones, just like you drew. Annie smiled quietly. Across the gravel lot, Michael Whitmore stood with the lead architect and a small group of project managers. He wasn't in a suit today, just jeans, boots, and a navy windbreaker with no company logo. He noticed Annie immediately, excused himself mid-conversation, walked over. You approve? He asked her. Annie tilted her head thoughtfully, studying the half-built structure. It needs more light, she said. Whitmore glanced at the architect. Can we extend the eastern windows another 2 feet? The architect blinked, then nodded slowly. It's possible. Do it. Annie's eyes widened. You can just change it like that? Whitmore gave a small smile. Sometimes, she seemed impressed, but not by the authority. By the responsiveness. Martha watched the exchange quietly. Most men with that kind of power, she said gently, wouldn't ask a child. Whitmore looked at the rising beams. Most men with that kind of power didn't almost miss what she heard. They stood in silence for a moment as a crane swung another steel support into place. Annie tugged lightly at Whitmore's sleeve. Will kids who don't have money be able to come? Yes. All of them? Yes. She nodded, satisfied. Then it's good. Whitmore exhaled slowly. Simple metrics. Clear standards. Later that afternoon, inside headquarters, a different kind of construction was underway. Whitmore chaired the first meeting of the newly formed Internal Ethics Council, a rotating body of employees across departments, from junior analysts to senior engineers. No executives filtering input. No assistant screening comments. One by one, employees spoke. Concerns about communication gaps. Suggestions for mentorship programs. Questions about long-term accountability. Whitmore took notes himself, not because he had to, because he chose to. At one point, a young cybersecurity engineer cleared her throat nervously. "Sir," she said, "before the incident, some of us felt reporting issues might cost us promotions." Whitmore didn't look defensive. "That will not happen again," he said evenly. "Respectfully," she added, "how do we know?" The room grew very still. Whitmore considered the question carefully. "You don't," he said honestly. "Trust isn't rebuilt by policy. It's rebuilt by consistency. Hold me accountable." A murmur moved through the table. He meant it. That evening, Annie sat at the kitchen table in their apartment, practicing reading aloud. Martha folded laundry nearby. "Grandma," Annie asked suddenly, "why did Mr. Whitmore almost not listen?" Martha paused. "Because sometimes when people get very powerful," she said, "they start believing they already know everything important." Annie frowned. "That's not true." "No," Martha agreed softly. "It's not." Annie looked down at her book again. "I'm glad he stopped." "So am I." At the construction site the following week, a small sign appeared at the entrance. Community Aviation and Technology Center. Below it, in smaller letters, "Listening changes everything." Whitmore had hesitated before approving the phrase. It felt personal, but personal was precisely the point. He stood with Ruiz near the fence as workers installed the signage. "Media's starting to pick up on this," Ruiz said quietly. Whitmore nodded. "Let them. Some are calling it reputation management." Whitmore didn't flinch. "Reputation follows action, not the other way around." Ruiz studied him for a moment. "You're not the same man I worked for 2 months ago." Whitmore's gaze remained on the building. "I hope not." Across the lot, Annie and a group of airport workers' children were playing tag between stacked pallets under supervised watch. Their laughter cut through the steady grind of machinery. Whitmore watched them carefully. That sound unfiltered joy felt like the clearest measure of whether this center mattered. He turned to Ruiz. "We focus too much on defense," he said quietly. "Not enough on opportunity." Ruiz nodded. "Defense keeps threats out," Whitmore continued. "Opportunity keeps resentment from growing." Ruiz smiled faintly. "That's a new strategy." "It's an old one," Whitmore corrected gently. "I just forgot it." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the unfinished steel beams gold, Annie climbed onto one of the safe concrete blocks near the fence. "Mr. Whitmore," she called. He walked over. She spread her arms wide toward the structure. "It looks brave," she said. He looked at the building again. Steel framework against open sky. Strong, but transparent. "That's what we're aiming for," he replied. She nodded thoughtfully. "Grandma says bravery isn't about not being scared." He crouched to her level. "What is it about?" "Doing the right thing while you're scared." Whitmore held her gaze. "I'll remember that." As evening settled over the airport, planes continued their steady departures. Engines roared. Lights blinked. Systems operated. But just beyond the main terminal, something quieter was rising. Not a monument to power. Not a branding exercise. A place where children would learn languages others underestimated. Where questions would not be dismissed because of age. Where listening would not be optional. Whitmore slipped his hands into his jacket pockets and stood there a long moment, watching the frame of the building take shape against the darkening sky. He had spent years building defenses. Now he was building something different. A space where no voice would need to shout to be heard. By late summer, the building no longer looked like a construction site. It looked like intention made visible. Glass walls reflected the wide American sky. The steel framework had been softened by warm brick along the lower exterior. Inside, polished concrete floors carried the echo of possibility rather than machinery. The Community Aviation and Technology Center stood complete. Michael Whitmore arrived early on opening morning, long before the small crowd began to gather. He walked through the entrance alone. Sunlight poured through the extended eastern windows, 2 extra feet of light, just as Annie had insisted. Dust motes drifted in the beams like quiet reminders that even air carried movement unseen. He stepped into the main hall. On one side, computer stations lined neatly beneath a sign reading Cyber and Code. On the other, a language lab, headphones resting at each seat, a world map stretching across the wall. At the far end, a small aviation learning corner, complete with a retired cockpit simulator donated by a regional airline. He ran his hand lightly along the smooth back of a chair. He had built larger facilities, more expensive ones, but none had felt like this. Behind him, the doors opened. Martha entered first, wearing her best navy dress. Annie followed, hair braided neatly, holding a pair of child-sized scissors tied with a red ribbon. Whitmore turned. "You're early," he said. Annie smiled. "I wanted to see it before everybody else." Martha stepped beside her. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. Whitmore shook his head slightly. "It's useful," he corrected gently. Annie walked slowly through the space, touching things with careful reverence. She stopped at the language lab. "Can I try it?" "Go ahead." She slipped on a headset and pressed a button. A recorded voice greeted her in Russian. She answered back fluently. Whitmore watched from a distance, something steady and unfamiliar settling in his chest again. Pride, but not in himself. In her. Outside, more people began to gather. Airport workers, families from nearby neighborhoods, a few city council members, some employees from Whitmore's company, standing quietly without fanfare. No media circus, just community. When it was time, Whitmore stepped to the small podium set near the entrance. He looked at the modest crowd. Then, at Annie. He didn't unfold prepared remarks. "I used to believe security was about control," he began evenly. "About systems. About staying ahead of threats." He paused. "I was wrong." A murmur rippled softly through the audience. "Security is about attention," he continued. "About listening before danger escalates. About recognizing that wisdom does not correlate with age, title, or power." He glanced toward Annie. Sometimes it sounds like a small voice refusing to be ignored. Martha felt her throat tighten. Whitmore stepped back slightly and gestured to Annie. She approached the ribbon, hands steady despite the crowd. He crouched beside her. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "Listening changes everything," she whispered. Then she cut the ribbon. Applause rose, not thunderous, but warm. Genuine. Children entered first, scattering toward the computer stations and the cockpit simulator with open curiosity. Whitmore stood back, letting the moment unfold without centering himself inside it. An elderly airport mechanic approached him quietly. "Never thought I'd see something like this here," the man said. Whitmore nodded. "Neither did I." The mechanic smiled faintly. "Takes courage to build something that doesn't pay you back." Whitmore watched Annie guide another child toward the language lab. "It already has," he replied. Later, as the crowd thinned and afternoon light mellowed, Whitmore found himself sitting on a bench near the large windows. Annie plopped down beside him, slightly out of breath. "It works," she announced. "What does?" "The place." He smiled faintly. "Good." She looked up at him thoughtfully. "Are you still scared sometimes?" He didn't dismiss the question. "Yes." "Of what?" He considered it. "Of missing something important again." She leaned her head lightly against his arm. "Then keep listening." He nodded slowly. "I will." Across the room, Martha spoke with a group of parents, explaining enrollment schedules and volunteer rotations. Community was forming organically, without corporate branding, without forced narrative, just people stepping toward one another. As evening approached, the golden light through the extended windows stretched long across the floor. Whitmore stood and walked to the center of the room. Children's laughter echoed lightly against the high ceiling. No alarms, no urgency, just learning. He thought back to the runway, to the moment he almost didn't turn. The trajectory of his life had shifted not because of a strategic pivot but because of humility forced upon him by truth. And now that truth had walls and windows and doors that would stay open, Annie tugged his sleeve one more time before leaving. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Yes. When I grow up, can I work here?" He smiled. "You can lead it." She grinned. "Only if I still get to yell when something's wrong." He laughed softly. "That will always be allowed." As Martha and Annie stepped out into the cooling evening air, Whitmore remained inside for a few moments longer. He stood alone in the quiet hum of a building filled with purpose. He understood something now that he had once dismissed. Justice is not only delivered in courtrooms, it is built in rooms like this, brick by brick, choice by choice, voice by voice. And as the last of the daylight faded through the wide eastern windows, 2 feet wider because a child had asked, Michael Whitmore felt certain of one thing. The most powerful transformation does not begin with authority. It begins with listening. Autumn arrived quietly. Leaves gathered along the edges of the airport parking lots, caught in small whirlwinds each time a jet taxied past. The air carried that unmistakable shift, cooler mornings, earlier sunsets, a hint of reflection settling over everything. The Community Aviation and Technology Center had been open for 3 months. Enrollment had doubled. The language lab was full most afternoons. The cockpit simulator had a waiting list. Volunteer sign-ups stretched into the new year. Michael Whitmore stood near the back of the main hall one Wednesday evening, observing a robotics workshop in progress. 10 children sat around folding tables, carefully wiring small motor kits, under the guidance of a retired Air Force engineer named Mr. Callahan. Annie was at the center of the table, tongue pressed lightly against her lip in concentration. Check polarity, she reminded another child. If you reverse it, it won't move. Callahan looked up at Whitmore and smiled. She's got leadership instincts, he said quietly. Whitmore nodded. She had them before I knew how to recognize them. Across the room, Martha was helping a group of parents fill out scholarship forms for weekend enrichment programs. She moved slowly but steadily, reading each line carefully, ensuring no one felt rushed or embarrassed. Whitmore walked toward her. You've turned this into more than a center, he said. Martha glanced around the room. It was always more than a building, she replied. You just gave it walls. He considered that. For years, he said softly. I thought impact required scale. And now? She asked. Now I see it requires proximity. She smiled. Getting closer isn't weakness. No, he agreed. It's accountability. A small commotion erupted near the entrance. Ruiz entered, his expression more serious than usual. Whitmore immediately sensed the shift. Excuse me, he said quietly to Martha, and walked over. What is it? He asked. Ruiz lowered his voice. Anonymous threat email, referencing the trial. Referencing you. Whitmore's jaw tightened slightly. Credible? Unclear. Security's sweeping facilities as precaution. Whitmore's gaze drifted across the room toward Annie, laughing now as her small robot finally rolled forward in a crooked line. For a brief moment, fear resurfaced. Not for himself. For this place. For what it represented. He forced his breathing steady. No panic, he said firmly. Quiet sweep. Keep parents unaware unless necessary. Ruiz nodded and moved efficiently. Whitmore remained where he stood, scanning exits, posture calm, eyes sharp. He felt the old instincts reactivating. Threat assessment, contingency planning, control. But layered over it now was something different. Perspective. Annie looked up and caught his eye from across the room. She could read him better than most executives ever had. She excused herself from the table and walked over. What happened? She asked softly. He crouched to her level. Probably nothing, he said honestly. Just someone trying to scare us. She studied his face carefully. Are you scared? He didn't lie. A little. She nodded slowly. Grandma says fear is a signal, not a boss. He almost smiled despite himself. That's wise. She leaned closer. Are we safe? Yes. She held his gaze for a long second, then nodded once. Okay. No drama. No spiraling anxiety. Just trust. Within 20 minutes, Ruiz returned. False alarm, he confirmed quietly. Traceable. To an overseas IP. No credible follow-through. Whitmore exhaled, but not in relief alone. In recognition, threat would always exist. Power attracts opposition. Change disrupts resentment. But fear did not get to dictate action anymore. He gathered the group's attention gently. Ladies and gentlemen, he said evenly, we had a minor security protocol check. Everything is clear. Please continue. The room resumed its rhythm. Children returned to circuits and coding. Parents resumed conversation. Life, uninterrupted. Later that evening, after the last family left and lights dimmed to half power, Whitmore stood alone in the center of the room again. Annie approached, backpack slung over one shoulder. You didn't shut it down, she said. No. Why? He looked around the quiet space. Because if we let fear close doors, then the people who threaten win. She nodded thoughtfully. That's what I thought. Martha joined them, coat draped over her arm. You handled that well, she said quietly. Whitmore shook his head. We handled it. She smiled faintly. No, she said gently. You stayed. He thought about that. Months ago, his instinct might have been to evacuate, isolate, retreat behind layers of security. Tonight, he had chosen steadiness instead. They stepped outside together. The runway lights blinked steadily against the dark sky. A plane lifted off in the distance, engines roaring before fading into quiet altitude. Annie slipped her small hand into his. You know, she said thoughtfully, bad things might keep happening. Yes, he agreed, but good things can keep happening too. He looked down at her. That's the plan. She smiled. Then we're even. As Martha led Annie toward the car, Whitmore remained near the entrance a moment longer. He understood something now with clarity that could not be taught in boardrooms or strategy seminars. Courage is not the absence of threat. It is the refusal to let threat define the future. He glanced once more at the illuminated sign above the door. Listening changes everything. The words no longer felt like a reminder. They felt like a commitment. And as he walked toward his own car under the cool autumn sky, Michael Whitmore knew that whatever challenges followed, he would meet them differently than before, not from a fortress, but from within the community he had chosen to stand inside. Winter settled in with a sharper edge than usual. Frost traced delicate patterns along the wide eastern windows of the Community Aviation and Technology Center, the very windows Annie had insisted be larger. From inside, the glass glowed softly against the early dusk, warm light spilling across the snow-dusted pavement. The center had become a rhythm now. Mondays for coding, Wednesdays for aviation labs, Fridays for language exchange nights, where retired mechanics practiced English while children practiced Russian, Spanish, and Arabic. Michael Whitmore no longer checked in as a visitor. He showed up as part of the pattern. On this particular evening, a small crowd gathered in the main hall for the first annual Listening Forum, an open microphone night where kids and adults could share ideas, concerns, or stories. No executives at a raised table. No hierarchy. Just folding chairs arranged in a circle. Whitmore sat between a baggage handler named Louise and a single mother who worked TSA security. Annie sat cross-legged near the front, swinging her boots slightly. Martha stood at the front with a clipboard. This place was built because someone small spoke up, she began gently. So tonight, everyone gets that same chance. One by one, voices filled the room. A teenage boy suggested drone safety workshops. A grandmother asked for financial literacy classes. Louise proposed a mentorship pipeline for airport maintenance careers. Whitmore wrote notes on a simple legal pad, not on a tablet, not filtered through an assistant. Then Annie raised her hand. Martha smiled. Yes, ma'am? Annie stood, smoothing her sweater nervously. I think, she began carefully, we should have a quiet room. A quiet room? Martha asked. For kids who feel scared, Annie said. Not because something bad is happening, just because sometimes loud places make your heart beat fast. The room grew thoughtful. Whitmore felt something shift in his chest. An airport was rarely quiet. Engines, announcements, movement. For a child who had once heard danger in that noise, the need made sense. That's a strong idea, Whitmore said gently. What would it have? Annie thought. Soft chairs, maybe headphones, and someone who listens. The last words hung in the air. Someone who listens. Martha nodded slowly. We can do that. Applause followed, not loud, but affirming. After the forum ended and families trickled out into the cold evening, Whitmore lingered by the windows with Ruiz. You see what this is becoming? Ruiz asked quietly. Whitmore watched a group of kids chase each other across the parking lot, laughter fogging in the winter air. Yes, he said. It's not about preventing one tragedy anymore. Ruiz nodded. It's about preventing isolation. Whitmore exhaled slowly. For years, I thought threats were external, he said. Competitors, hackers, saboteurs. And now I see the deeper threat is disconnection. Across the room, Annie and Martha were helping stack chairs. Annie carried two at once, wobbling slightly but determined. Whitmore crossed the floor and took the chairs from her. Teamwork. he reminded gently. She grinned. I'm strong, I know. As they set the chairs down, Annie glanced up at him. Do you ever miss how things were before? She asked. He considered the question carefully. Before what? Before you had to change. Whitmore looked out the window again. Snow fell softly, steady and quiet. I miss the simplicity, he admitted. But not the blindness. She nodded, satisfied. Blindness is worse. Yes, he agreed. It is. A week later, construction began on the new quiet room. Not large, just a side space with soft lighting, insulated walls, and shelves of books. Annie helped choose the paint color, a calm shade of pale blue. On the day it opened, a small plaque was placed beside the door. The listening room, suggested by Annie Johnson. Whitmore hesitated before approving the name. She didn't ask for recognition. But recognition, he had learned, was part of justice too. That afternoon, a young boy overwhelmed by noise from a nearby school field trip sat inside the quiet room. Headphones on, breathing steadily while a volunteer read softly nearby. Whitmore stood outside the door for a moment, watching through the small window. He remembered his own childhood, a stern father, a house where emotion was controlled, not expressed, strength measured in silence. He had learned early not to ask for quiet, not to ask for space. Perhaps that was why he built walls instead. Annie appeared beside him. It works, she whispered. He nodded. Yes, he said quietly. It does. Later that evening, Whitmore received a call from a national nonprofit organization interested in replicating the center's model in other cities. Scaling impact, the director called it. Whitmore listened carefully. He did not reject the idea, but he did not rush it either. This only works, he said evenly, if it stays rooted in community voice. It cannot become branding. The director paused. That's unusual, she admitted. Whitmore almost smiled. Listening usually is. After the call, he sat alone in the main hall. Lights dimmed, snow continuing outside. He thought about the runway again, about that first shout, about the moment everything pivoted. Justice had begun as interruption, but transformation had become infrastructure. And infrastructure, he now understood, required maintenance, attention, humility. Annie ran back into the hall, coat half-zipped. Grandma says we're leaving. Whitmore stood. All right. She stopped in front of him. You know, she said seriously, you didn't just build this place. He raised an eyebrow. No? You stayed. The simplicity of it struck him harder than any courtroom sentence. He knelt slightly to meet her eyes. I plan to keep staying. She smiled, satisfied. As the door closed behind her and Martha, Whitmore remained a moment longer in the quiet hall. The listening room light glowed softly down the corridor. He realized something that had taken him 40 years to understand. Leadership is not proven in moments of control. It is proven in moments of presence. And presence begins the same way justice does. By listening, the first anniversary of the runway incident arrived without ceremony. No press releases, no commemorative plaques. Just an ordinary Thursday morning painted in early spring light. Michael Whitmore stood at the large eastern windows of the Community Aviation and Technology Center, watching a commercial jet rise steadily into a pale blue sky. The engines roared, then softened, then disappeared into altitude. 1 year, 12 months since a small voice had cut through routine and forced him to turn. Behind him, the center buzzed with after-school energy. Laughter, keyboards clicking, snippets of foreign phrases drifting through the language lab. The listening room door stood slightly ajar. Inside, a volunteer read quietly to a young girl who needed a break from the noise. It had become normal now, and that, Whitmore thought, was the real miracle. Annie burst through the main doors a moment later, taller than she had been a year ago, backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders. Mr. Whitmore, she called. He turned, already smiling. You're early. Teacher let us out 5 minutes sooner, she said triumphantly. I ran. Martha followed at a steadier pace. You didn't run, she corrected gently. You power walked with enthusiasm. Annie grinned. Whitmore noticed something different in her posture, less uncertainty, more ease. She no longer scanned rooms instinctively for danger. She entered them expecting to belong. That alone felt like victory. Do you know what day it is? She asked him. He held her gaze. Yes, she nodded solemnly. You almost got on the plane. I did. And I yelled, You did. She studied him for a long second. I'm glad you stopped. He crouched slightly to her level. So am I. Martha watched them quietly. Anniversaries can reopen wounds. But this one felt different. It felt like proof. Later that afternoon, Whitmore hosted a small internal gathering at the center for his executive team, not at headquarters, not behind glass walls. They sat in folding chairs. No elevated stage. No formal agenda. I wanted you here, Whitmore began, because leadership must remain connected to consequence. He gestured around the room. This exists because someone without rank or title spoke up and I nearly ignored her. The executives listened carefully. For years, he continued, we believed risk management was technical. It is not. It is human. Culture determines whether warnings surface or suffocate. He paused. If we ever build an environment where a child or an employee feels their voice won't matter, then we have failed. The room was silent, not uncomfortable, reflective. After the meeting, one senior vice president lingered behind. Sir, she said quietly, my daughter comes here on Saturdays. She's thinking about studying engineering now. Whitmore nodded. That's good. She used to think it wasn't for her. He met her eyes. Now she knows it is. Across the hall, Annie was teaching a new student how to introduce himself in Russian. You roll the R like this. She demonstrated carefully. The boy laughed as he tried. Whitmore watched from a distance. He had once measured impact in market share percentages. Now he measured it in confidence gained, in shoulders straightened, in laughter that carried no edge of fear. As evening settled, a small gathering formed outside the center near the runway fence. Not planned, just organic. Airport workers finishing shifts, parents picking up children, a few employees from Whitmore's company who had chosen to volunteer. Someone brought a thermos of coffee. Another passed around homemade cookies. Annie stood on the low concrete barrier and raised her hand dramatically. Attention, she called. The small group laughed but quieted. 1 year ago, she began carefully, I heard something bad. The wind tugged lightly at her hair, and I was scared. She looked directly at Whitmore, but I yelled anyway. A soft murmur of approval passed through the group. And now, she continued, sweeping her arm toward the center, we have this. She hopped down. That's all. Applause rose gentle, sincere. Whitmore felt something tighten in his throat. He stepped forward, not to deliver a speech, but to stand beside her. Justice, he said quietly, is not only about stopping harm, it's about building good. He looked around at the faces gathered, diverse, ordinary, invested. Fear isolates, listening connects, and connection protects, more than any system I've ever designed. The runway lights flickered on as dusk deepened. A plane taxied past slowly, its windows glowing. Annie slipped her hand into his again. You didn't miss it, she said softly. Miss what? The important thing. He understood. He squeezed her hand gently. No, he said. I didn't. As the small crowd began to disperse, Martha remained beside him for a moment. You know, she said, most men in your position would have written a check and moved on. Whitmore looked at the illuminated center. That would have been easier. And safer. He nodded. Yes. She studied him carefully. But you stayed. He smiled faintly. Yes, he said. I did. When the last car pulled away and the night settled fully over the airport, Whitmore stood alone once more by the wide eastern windows. The glass reflected his image faintly older, perhaps softer, but steadier. He thought back to the man he had been 12 months earlier. Efficient, respected, isolated. He did not despise that man. He understood him, but he no longer wanted to be him. Behind him, the listening room light remained on, casting a gentle glow down the hallway. Outside, another plane lifted into the night sky. Whitmore watched it climb, steady and purposeful. 1 year ago, altitude had nearly meant annihilation. Now it meant perspective. And as the sound of the engines faded into quiet distance, he understood something with complete clarity. Sometimes the smallest interruption becomes the greatest course correction, and sometimes the bravest voice in the room belongs to the person everyone else underestimated. The following spring arrived with a softness that felt earned. Dogwood trees bloomed along the perimeter road of the airport, their white petals drifting lightly across sidewalks that had once carried nothing but hurried footsteps and the hum of departure. Inside the Community Aviation and Technology Center, Preparations were underway for the Youth Future Showcase, an event planned not by executives, but by the students themselves. Booths lined the main hall, robotics demonstrations, language performances, flight simulation challenges, mentorship sign-ups. At the center of it all stood Annie Johnson, now 7, her hair pulled back neatly, a small name badge pinned to her cardigan. Annie Johnson, student mentor. Michael Whitmore adjusted a banner near the entrance and stepped back to examine it. He had insisted his own name appear nowhere on the signage this year. The center belonged to the community now, and the community knew it. Ruiz approached quietly. "Security's clear," he said. "Local officials are here, but no press conference unless you want one." Whitmore shook his head. "No podium." Ruiz nodded, faint smile in place. "You've changed." Whitmore considered that. "I've listened." Across the hall, Martha arranged trays of homemade cookies and coffee urns. She greeted older visitors warmly, shaking hands, making introductions, ensuring everyone felt seen. The room filled gradually. Retired pilots, airport janitors, teachers, single parents, young engineers, children clutching project boards with careful pride. At 3 o'clock sharp, Annie stepped onto a low platform near the center of the hall. No spotlight, just the natural brightness from the wide eastern windows. She held a small piece of paper but barely glanced at it. "Welcome," she began clearly. "Last year, something almost went very wrong." The room quieted, but someone listened, she continued. "And because someone listened, we're all here." Her voice did not tremble. She had grown into it. "This place," she gestured around her, "is not about planes, or business, or even about being brave once." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "It's about not ignoring small voices." Whitmore felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He had once commanded boardrooms with financial forecasts and acquisition plans. This felt far more consequential. Annie continued, "When people listen, they stop bad things. But they also start good things." Applause rose, not loud, but steady and sincere. After the opening, the hall came alive with movement. A group of teenagers demonstrated a drone safety system designed to detect unauthorized signal interference. A father and daughter explained a budgeting app they had coded for families navigating hourly wages. In the listening room, now fully integrated into the center's layout, a sign read, "Quiet is strength." Whitmore moved through the space slowly, greeting volunteers, asking questions, kneeling occasionally to examine projects at eye level. He no longer rushed. He no longer scanned rooms only for threat. He scanned for growth. Near the language lab, Annie stood beside a poster board displaying Russian phrases. A new student hesitated in front of it. "I can't roll the R," the boy muttered, embarrassed. Annie smiled gently. "You couldn't hear it before," she said. "But you will." Whitmore caught the line. He paused. "You couldn't hear it before, but you will." It struck him that the sentence applied far beyond pronunciation. Later that afternoon, a small ceremony took place not announced on any formal agenda. Martha stepped forward with a framed photograph. It was from the day of the runway incident, Annie's hand gripping Whitmore's coat, his expression frozen between skepticism and realization. The moment before everything shifted, Martha handed it to Whitmore. "For the center," she said quietly, "not your office." He nodded, understanding. The photograph was mounted near the entrance not as spectacle, but as reminder. Below it, a simple plaque. "Courage speaks. Wisdom listens." As evening approached, the crowd thinned into smaller conversations. Sunlight faded into amber through the tall windows. Whitmore stepped outside for air. The runway stretched long and steady in the distance. A plane began its ascent, engines rising, wheels lifting. Annie joined him, slipping her hand into his as she had done a year ago. "You're thinking," she observed. "Yes." "About what?" He watched the aircraft climb into open sky. "About how close I came to losing everything." She tilted her head. "But you didn't." "No," he said. "Because you interrupted me." She smiled faintly. "I yelled." "Yes," he agreed softly. "You did." They stood in silence for a moment. Wind moved gently across the pavement. "Do you think," Annie asked, "that bad things will always try to happen?" He considered his answer carefully. "Yes," he said. "But I also think good people will always interrupt them." She seemed satisfied with that. Inside, laughter echoed faintly through the doors. The door no longer felt like a response to crisis. It felt like infrastructure for hope. Whitmore understood something now that he had once dismissed as sentimental. Power without humility isolates. Wealth without responsibility corrodes. But influence anchored in listening transforms. He looked down at Annie. "You saved my life," he said quietly. She shook her head gently. "You stopped." He smiled. "Yes," he admitted. "I did." The sky deepened into early evening blue. Runway lights flickered on in orderly rows, steady and unwavering. 1 year ago, he had believed strength meant control. Now he knew better. Strength meant pausing long enough to hear the smallest warning. Strength meant staying present after the crisis passed. Strength meant building rooms where fear could soften into confidence. As the final plane of the evening lifted into the sky, its engines fading into distance, Michael Whitmore felt no rush of adrenaline, no edge of suspicion, only steady resolve. He had built corporations before. He had built systems. He had built wealth. But the most important thing he had ever built was this, a place where a child's voice would never again have to fight to be heard. And as Annie leaned lightly against his side, watching the aircraft disappear into the horizon, he understood something with complete certainty. Sometimes the smallest voice carries the greatest truth, and sometimes the loudest change begins with one brave interruption. This story reminds us that courage is not measured by age, status, or power, but by the willingness to speak when something is wrong. A 6-year-old girl, overlooked and underestimated, changed the course of a powerful man's life simply because she refused to stay silent. The lesson is clear. Justice often depends on whether we choose to listen, especially to the smallest, quietest voices. For many adults, especially those who have lived long enough to see both loyalty and betrayal, the message resonates deeply. Success means little without humility, and strength is not control, but the courage to pause, to hear, and to act with integrity. In a world where people are often dismissed because of their age, race, or position, the story calls us back to a simple truth: every voice matters, and sometimes the one we least expect carries the truth that saves us all. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.